Good evening, everyone. You're listening to Red Pill 78. I am the Corruption Detector, and this is your Red Pill News. This is a very special presentation. My guest tonight is David Paulides, author and researcher. He has written a series of books called Missing 411. It deals with a series of cases of strange disappearances of people from national parks and other remote areas. David has been hard at work at this for many, many years, and his background as a police officer uniquely placed him to be able to really get to the bottom of what's going on. Now, please join me in welcoming my guest to the show, David Paulides. First of all, a big thank you to Vikings War of Clans for sponsoring this video. The dev team there wanted me to try out the game. I figured, hey, it's free, why not? But after 5 minutes, I was hooked. So Vikings War of Clans was inspired by the famous strategy and RPG games of the 90s. Today, all the games are about running and hiding and shooting, but Vikings gives you a deep strategic experience. If you're looking for a game that combines strategy, team play, and where time invested will pay off with victories, this game is for you. It's got a great visual style, it's packed with excellent 3D graphics and a gorgeous presentation, plus a really immersive soundtrack. You start out in the role of Jarl, the leader of your own kingdom. You begin by building your town, searching the area for resources, and then building up your army. And another thing I really like about this game is that it's not a real-time shooter where you blink and then bam, you're dead for the match. I can play for 5 minutes or 5 hours and pick it up when I feel like it. But basically you can choose your own styles. Some players like to explore, some focus on building their cities, some others like researching technologies, but all of them can discover a mythical world. My favorite part is the deep character and strategy progression. The more you play, the more you build up your character, and the more you can do. Help support my channel by downloading Vikings for free, only from my link in the description box, and get the special bonus of 200 gold coins and a protective shield. Don't forget to look me up and join my Vikings clan under the nickname Wolfsbane78. So, joining me today is a good friend of the program, David Paulides. David is an author, researcher, and so much more. Dave, thank you for being here on the show with us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So, Dave, you are author of the Missing 411 book series, and I know that you're a former police officer. Can you tell us just how did you get into this research?
So, about 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago now, I was in a national park doing some peripheral work and background on another topic, and I saw a couple of national park rangers following me around. And which isn't unusual. And when I'm in the park, I'm usually never talking to the official people. I'm always talking to the workers and things that are contractors in the park because they'll talk. At the end of the day, one of these park rangers knocked on the door and he said, "Hey, Dave, we were following you. We kind of knew who you were, and my partner and I wanted to talk to you about something." I said, "Sure." And initially it was just one. Then later on another guy came and they said they had worked at a series of parks and that they had seen disappearances happen from these various areas. And initially there was a lot of publicity, a lot of effort to find the people, and then after 7 to 10 days there was almost nothing. And they thought it was strange, and then they tried to find some information about the cases, and they were thwarted in their attempts, which they thought was even more strange. And then as time went on, they saw that people were disappearing in areas that they thought themselves didn't make sense. And what I mean by that is that, you know, if somebody disappears far back in the backcountry and you never find them, you know, you kind of understand that, I guess. But when people disappear in the valley floor where there shouldn't be any disappearances because there's a lot of people and a lot of witnesses, they thought it was odd. And so they said somebody ought to look into it. So the next day I was leaving the park, I called some law enforcement friends and I explained to them what I heard. And I said, "Hey, could you run and see if there's any disappearances or there's a number of them in national parks?" They came back a couple hours later and said, "Oh my God, yeah, there's a lot, and there doesn't seem to be much going on there as far as publicity or effort to find these people, because after a short period of time, all the information about it kind of dries up." I said, "Okay." So from that, I came back and I filed a series of Freedom of Information Acts against the National Park Service Police requesting a list of missing people from their jurisdiction. And many people don't know this, but the National Park Service Police a large contingent of federally trained law enforcement people, very highly trained, better trained than most police departments. And the common place to start would be to get the list and do the research from the list. And after I filed that, several months later, I get a call from an attorney from the National Park Service asking me why I wanted that list. And this doesn't make much sense because, according to the Freedom of Information Act, why a person asks for any information from the government is irrelevant and can't be used against them about why the government will give up that information. And I told him that. And the attorney said, no. We're not here to decide if you're going to get the information or not. We just want to know why you want it. I still thought that was odd. But I said, oh, okay, well, I just want it for research. And this person said, well, we don't have any lists of missing people. And as somebody who knows what's politically correct in the world and what's not, and knowing that you or anybody else could go into any small and medium-sized police department in the U.S. and ask that police chief for a list of missing persons in their jurisdiction, within an hour, they would have a list of missing people. And so initially I thought, oh, this is really odd. And he said, no, we don't have any lists and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, well, maybe it's a semantics issue because I just couldn't believe it. The National Park Service Police would have a list of missing people from each of their parks and monuments. So we refiled again, and this time it came back again. Same attorney calls me and says, no, we understood your first request. We don't keep track of these missing people. And again, I didn't believe it. I still don't believe it. So I talked to a series of professional journalists, and nobody believed it. And in fact, George Knapp, who's the chief investigative journalist for CBS in Las Vegas, he said on the air, they're lying. They have a list. They don't want to give it up for some reason. And I suppose that's what started it all, and that's how we got on the move to say, well, if they won't give us a list, we'll just do the hardcore research, go through the archives, and find out as best we can how many people are missing.
And about how many people have you identified as being part of this missing 411 phenomenon?
So since we started on national parks, then we kind of jetted off into federal government land, BIA land, U.S. Forest Service land, and then we have more cases from even private property. But in total, there's almost 1,100 cases.
Wow. Right. So so this is basically just like a phenomena in remote areas, essentially.
So I've written 7 books about missing people in fairly remote areas. And I've written one book called Missing 411: A Sobering Coincidence, which fits the profile points we established, but it's about predominantly young men who disappear from sometimes an urban area, and they're found in a body of water. It could be a pond, a lake, a river. Most times the coroners will come back, will say, well, they drowned, but there's no way to figure out how they got from point to point. Nobody ever sees them enter the water. And on a large number of those cases, they can't figure out why the person died. So that's the one caveat to the missing cases that people kind of don't understand, is that there is that one book that's a big seller because there's a lot of these cases out there.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's crazy. I mean, overall, what is it that kind of classifies a case as part of this missing 411 phenomenon? There's a set of data points?
So if you look at 3 or 4 missing cases, it's not going to really jump out at you that they're going to be different. If you look at 100, well, after about 200 or 300 cases, I started to put stacks in my living room that had these common points to them. And right away, what struck me is I used to be on a SWAT team when I was a policeman, and we had the canine unit attached to us, which was 20 dogs. And we always would go out with them and search for bad guys, and they went with us on bad entries and things like that. And I was around these dogs all the time, and they were the most eager group of canines I've ever seen to go work. They all wanted to get out there and help. But the dogs that I read about in a lot of these cases, they'd be taken to the point where the person was last seen, and sometimes they'd walk in a circle and lay down. Sometimes they'd walk down the trail and just lay down. Sometimes they were completely uninterested or afraid. It was hard to determine what. But one of the most common profile points is canines can't pick up a scent or won't track. And that is not normal, especially when you have, say, a family saying, hey, this is the point where my daughter was last with us, right here. So you have a credible location, a credible place to start, and you bring the dogs there and they can't find a scent. Something's really weird. But this has happened in hundreds of cases. So in these cases, we've seen these points where we start to say, okay, that's profile point number one. Number two is there appears to be a weather event in conjunction with the disappearance, meaning that after the person disappears, it either starts to rain or snow or something to encumber the search, or as the person's disappearing, there's some kind of event that will encumber the search, or there's something that restricts search and rescue efforts that's related to weather. That's another one. Another big one is that we have two ends of the intellectual spectrum. We have people with disabilities or with inherited type of complexities to their thinking process. We have Alzheimer's, autism, things like that. And then on the other end, we have people that are super high intellectuals, like physicists, who have disappeared. And both ends of the spectrum were represented in a large way. There's also a genetic anomaly in that it appears that people with German descent disappear more than all others. And then boulders come into play in granite. A lot of people disappear around boulders and granite, or are either found in boulders or around boulders and granite. And then water comes into play too, just like I stated earlier. But those are the most common ones right there.
You know, it's interesting learning that there is this spectrum of people with some type of interesting disorder or something wrong with them. Going from perhaps, maybe slightly handicapped to genius level. These are like people that, would make an interesting study. That's like the first thing that I thought when I heard you saying that before.
Well, as you get into it, that's one train of thought. But then the other thing is that I was giving a presentation at a conference the other day, and we were on the same track of thinking. And I made a presentation about all of the physicists that have disappeared and haven't been found. And I said, in all of the work I've done, I've never found anything but a German physicist that disappeared.
Oh, wow.
How odd is that?
That's extremely odd.
Yeah.
Now, when you're thinking of all of the cases, the number of cases that you've looked into, how many of them have like some level, of that interesting aspect? I mean, is it pretty much all of them, or is it just greater than half?
Oh no, it's a subgroup of that larger number, but it's a number that makes you take note.
Statistically
as far
significant.
As the actual breakdown, I've never sat down and actually done it, but it's more than anybody else.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Now the other cool thing about this here is that you've gone from this many books that you've written, and now you've got it available in two different film presentations. Do you have any plans on making additional films?
We've been asked to do a third one, and nothing's in production yet, and we're still kind of talking about it, but we'll see. I mean, films are a lot different than books. I mean, I can sit down and pound out a book in 3 or 4 months. Movies take a couple years.
Really? And
they're complex and they're super expensive. So unless we've got a real good storyline that we can all agree on, probably not going to do it. If we come up with something that's viable and understandable and we think people will like it, yeah, we'll do it. The most common comment I've had about our movies is people will say that, well, I saw the movie and it was good, but how come you didn't cover more cases? And I think people don't understand that in a documentary you have between maybe 90 and 120 minutes. That's
right.
The standard length. And if I just pound in a ton of cases, yeah, you're going to get a real brief overview of a few, maybe 10 people, but you're not going to know the intimate details that make that case interesting or the intimate details behind that person's life that led up to the disappearance, which really makes for a compelling story. If I just throw a bunch of names at you and a bunch of profile points, hey, so what? I mean, I think you want to know the story behind the story, and that's kind of the method that we're taking. So I think in the way we do it, if we're going to do it again, you're probably never going to get more than 4 or 5 cases at a time, because after that, it just gets diluted so much it's worthless.
I tend to agree. I mean, I think you guys did a great job on both of the movies. I think that the premise and the setup, having 2 distinctly different subsets of people that you're talking about in each of the films. I think the third film would be great if you did those people found in urban areas, the people drowning. I think that that's extremely fascinating because from the information that I've learned, just about those cases, I mean, I'd be personally interested in it. But how many clusters of missing people are we talking about here throughout North America?
There's 60.
60. Okay, and those range from national parks just to other government lands. How many of them are on private land?
Again, a point I've never really counted and delineated that, but there's clusters going all the way through the Sierra Nevada mountains in western U.S., up through the Cascades, around the top, up through Oregon, California, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Colorado. There's a big gap in disappearances in the middle of Nevada, and there's a big gap of disappearances right down the middle of the U.S. north to south, then going back up the Appalachian Trail along the eastern U.S., going north up through Maine, and then again, they completely encircle the Great Lakes. So in distances, if you really work it down, I think we've figured out that 80% of the clusters are within 250 miles of a major body of water, meaning the Pacific, the Atlantic, or the Great Lakes. That's pretty interesting for me because I'm from Michigan, knowing that. There's a lot of disappearances in Michigan, strange things. Wow. Now, are there any national parks that do not have clusters of missing people? Oh, absolutely, yeah. Okay. All right, so overwhelmingly, it's more safe than not being safe. Well, I tell people all the time, I go to national parks every chance I get. Yeah. I mean, I never will tell somebody not to go in there, but to do it safely. And the biggest message I ever have is when you're hiking on a trail, carry your personal locator beacon, go with somebody if you can. If you can't, tell somebody where you're going and make sure you come back and tell them when you're out safe. But always carry a personal locator beacon. They cost about $200 on Amazon, and they're well worth it. Have you ever seen a case where someone went missing and they were carrying a personal locator beacon? I know of 2. Okay. But so the other part of what you should carry, I never go anywhere without. I mean, I'm a policeman. I was trained. I was on a SWAT team, so I'm 100% comfortable carrying a gun all the time. Mm-hmm. I don't know of one case where somebody was carrying a personal locator beacon and a gun. Now, one of my books is about nothing but people that carried guns, and those are missing hunters. Mm-hmm. Now, none of those people that I wrote about were carrying a personal locator beacon, which is odd. I think most hunters should by now be cognizant that you should be carrying one, especially since they're a group that's off trail a lot. So I pass that message along all the time. All right. Wise words. Wise words. I know in the films you do go over a checklist, basically, of things that you should do if you are going to be traveling in these areas. So pay attention. You guys definitely need to see the movies. We're going to have a couple of links for people to go and purchase the movies where they can watch them in the description of this video after we're done. Now, in Missing 411, the first movie, you're talking about children that have gone missing. There was a little boy in Idaho who disappeared, who was camping with his parents, and then he was never found, which is just absolutely insane to me, to think that he could go missing in such a remote area and there's no trace of him to be found. What happened in that case? So first of all, let me preface that there's dozens and dozens of these cases in my books. This case is not unique. But we put it on the film because it was happening just as it was the closure in the initial investigation was just happening as we were filming, so we went with it. Now, in that incident, there was a husband and a wife, a grandpa, and a friend of the grandpa that were all camping together at this remote location. Now, the husband and wife were coming back from this creek with the little boy, 2 years old, and he says, hey, I want to go with Grandpa, and they go, okay, so they can see Grandpa, they can see the boy walking to Grandpa, and the other man is down by the creek kind of near where they were, and the parents turn around and go back to the creek. Well, somehow or another, the boy disappears between that and the point he was supposed to be at the grandpa. Now, the parents all say that Grandpa didn't go anywhere, Grandpa's somewhat disabled. The other guy that was with Grandpa was nowhere nearby. The boy disappears. They bring in canines. They can't pick up a scent, even though the boy was there and everyone says he was there, but they can't pick up a scent. And massive search. They've got nothing. And this was years ago now. It's almost 3 years ago. They still have nothing. And there's been a lot of nasty things stated about the parents on this case. And what I can tell you is that you can say a lot of nasty things about a lot of people. And in extreme conflict and in extreme anxiety and stress, people do a lot of strange things. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not an advocate for the parents or against the parents, but I will say that in my time in law enforcement and in my time dealing with missing people, I've seen relatives of missing people do very odd things. Now, our feeling, everybody on the crew that covered this case and was around these people, our feeling is either everybody at that scene had to be involved at some level, or nobody was involved. Because when you dissect their story, they either all know and are all protecting each other, or none of them know, and it's just like they said. And when you think that the husband and the wife that are the victims of this missing child have since divorced, and nobody's come over and pointed fingers at each other saying, yeah, you killed him or they killed him, none of that has happened. Mm. And you would think by now, if there was a hole in the story, somebody would have come forward. And as of right now, nobody has.
Yeah, I thought it was really sad the way that they were being treated by people there locally. And when you guys were filming, people walked by and said some stuff about them. You know, nobody knows how they're going to act in a situation like that. You know, grief manifests itself in very, different ways in every single person. In your experience as a law enforcement officer, I wanted to ask you this earlier and I forgot, but have you ever been in a situation or seen any other law enforcement agency that was not interested in tracking something like this? I mean, isn't missing people a pretty serious thing for everyone?
So I've got to say that missing children are handled probably the majority of the time by law enforcement quite different than missing adults. A lot of times, missing adults, law enforcement will take the case and they'll find out years later, hey, the person disappeared and they didn't want anything to do with their family and they just want to drop out of society. That's not a crime. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with it, and you can do that. And it's very frustrating if you've devoted thousands of hours to trying to find the person to figure out that's what happened. When it'd be really nice if they just dropped a dime on the law enforcement person and said, hey, I'm okay, just don't tell my family. You don't have to investigate me. I just don't want to talk to anyone. Mm-hmm. Okay, fine, That's great. We'll do it. But to not call them and not do anything, it gets really frustrating when this happens to law enforcement people multiple times in a career. It's a colossal waste of time. Now, small children, different ballgame. I was one of the investigators that was called out on the Paulides case out of Petaluma, California. And I can tell you that the FBI team that worked that and the other law enforcement people that were called in on that case, there was nothing more important in our lives when that case was going on than finding her. And I mean, everybody there gave 150% of their life to that case. Because I think all of us that had family looked at that little girl or look at that little boy and say, hey, that could have been us. Yeah. You got to do everything you can. Put yourself in that family's position and think, my God, somebody's got to help them.
So knowing that, what logical reason can you ascribe to the National Park Service, or was the Department of the Interior, not caring about keeping up with lists of people going missing in national parks? What logical reason is there for an agency to not be following up on this stuff?
There's none. Yeah. There is absolutely none. I mean, if you think about what the National Park Police is supposed to be doing is protecting us. Mm-hmm. And if they are withholding data that points to an issue, then they sure as heck aren't protecting us. And they're putting us into harm's way. Now, I've heard all kinds of theories from different people over the years. about why they may or may not be doing it, and none of it's good. One is that they're aware that there's an abnormal number of missing people and they don't want the public to know. Mm-hmm. There may be a cause out there that they can't control, and anything our government can't control, they won't acknowledge. They don't want to acknowledge. So those are probably two of the best I've heard.
I guess that makes sense. Just ignore it and it'll go away. Now, how do we know that, in these remote places, how do we know that people are not just being dragged off by animals, by wild animals? Since it's so remote, that seems like the most logical explanation that I can think of, especially like a little kid. People
Absolutely.
Yeah,
sure. So when a search and rescue team goes out and looks for somebody, they're going through a vetting process in their mind about what's happened. So one of the things that everyone's trained with search and rescue is to look for animal predation. So drag marks, blood, torn clothing. If somebody gets attacked by something, there's going to be screams. There's going to be tissue and blood and clothes and drag marks and torn up trails and torn up foliage in the area. It's going to be pretty obvious real quick that something major happened. And I encourage your listeners to go online and Google animal predation and then look at the photos. And I mean, anybody with a third grade education is going to be able to tell pretty quickly that somebody's been attacked. Now, that's the first vetting point we have in our research. Any evidence of animal predation, we won't take the case. Any evidence of criminal acts in conjunction with the disappearance, we won't take the case. Any evidence that mental illness, meaning the person mentally unstable, etc., wanted to maybe harm themselves, we won't take the case. We go through this vetting process, so we exclude all of those cases where your mind will quickly go to try to acknowledge, it's not really a serious case. This is really what happened. No, that's already been all vetted out.
All right. Well, there was a case of a little boy. His family, they owned a store. I believe he went missing, and then sometime later the remains were found. And in the movie, several people say that they ascribe it to animal attacks. But his father, he said that wasn't the case. And was that because all of those signs and symptoms were missing? He wasn't torn up. There wasn't the signs of an animal.
So probably the case, this is one case I know the best out of anything. And his dad actually owned a resort up in the mountains.
Yes.
And this little boy went off with a group of singles that were staying at the resort. And the single people lost track of the little boy on a trail. He was seen by some fishermen on the trail next to the river, kind of hitting a stick in the water. And the fisherman got mad at him. That was the last person that ever saw him. 4 years later, his remains are found 550 feet up this mountainside from the river. And my son and I went up there, and there's a YouTube video that we made of it that's on our site. If you Google Can-Am Missing Project on Google or on YouTube, you can see the video. And we had to get on our hands and knees. That's how steep it is going up the side of this mountain to where he was found. And the only thing they found 4 years later was his skull cap, one tooth. They found his pants inside out, and they found his sweatshirt and both shoes. Now, his dad and I are really good friends now because I was the only guy that really was with him and figured most of this stuff out. First of all, the shoes look as though that they haven't been in 4 heavy winters and summers at 9,000 feet. Animals don't turn pants inside out. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation took the clothing from this case, and they didn't find 1 ounce of blood on anything. And the biggest thing is that the county sheriff's department immediately had a press conference and said, well, it's obvious that a mountain lion killed this boy. And the dad told me, Dave, do you know my little boy never, ever, ever let me tie his shoes, and he always walked around with them kind of flopping on his feet. And he said, now, if a mountain lion drugged my boy up 550 feet up a mountainside, what are the chances those shoes would have been on? I said, about 0. And he goes, that's right. And he said, now if a mountain lion attacked my boy, all the mountain lion people, and he said he spoke to 4 of them, all said that a mountain lion didn't kill his boy because they would go right through that clothing and just tear it to shreds, getting to him to eat him. And the mountain lion experts, all 4 were unanimous and said a mountain lion didn't kill your boy. Now, the most unusual things, and I told his dad when I saw it, because they had crime scene photos that I obtained, and I showed him a picture of the skull of his boy. And I said, you see these striation marks on the skull? I said, I've never seen anything like this. And there were striation marks on the skull that made right-hand turns that were completely 90-degree angles. And I gave them to Harvey Pratt, who was the number 2 man in the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation. And I asked him to give it to them, his forensic examiner, that at the time was 75 years old and studied 5,000 cases. This guy came back and said, in all my years, in 5,000 cases, I've never seen a skull like that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was my next question, is how was the skull cap removed from the rest of the skull? And then where did the lower half of the skull go? Do you happen to have pictures of that? Did you include that in any of your books?
No, it's in the presentations I make, but it's not in the books.
Okay, all right. Well, hopefully next time you're doing a presentation, I can be there, because I'd be very interested to see what those look like. That's terrible. That's so sad. Well, in Missing 411: The Hunted, you exclusively talk about hunters that go missing. I mean, what is